Beneath the lacquered walls of the Forbidden City, a girl weeps silently as her childhood is shaved from her scalp. She is no longer a daughter, no longer herself, merely one petal among thousands, groomed to wilt in silence. In a palace where desire was protocol and obedience was art, concubines were not born, they were carved. Layer by layer, their identity peeled back to please a man who may never speak their name. This is not a love story. This is a story of discipline, humiliation, and sacrifice, where beauty was power and power was a curse. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and sorrow, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. The air was thick with the scent of powdered sandalwood and fear. Girls, barely past childhood, stood barefoot in a line that stretched like a shadow through the stone corridor. Each wore the same silken robe, pale pink, perfumed, anonymous. Behind their eyes flickered the last traces of names that would soon be erased. Some trembled. Others stood like statues, their spines stiffened by the silent warnings of their mothers. They were told not to speak, not to cry, not to draw the wrong kind of attention. They were told to become blank slates, vessels waiting to be chosen. Down the corridor, eunuchs shuffled with whispered authority, inspecting teeth, fingers, the curves of elbows and hips. Officials with scrolls marked girls for rejection, like farmers sorting grain. Too short, too dark, too spirited, too old. 13 was ideal. 15 was a risk. 17 was an embarrassment. A girl named Milan blinked at the floor. Her father had called her Little Plum Blossom. She hadn't spoken since the cart took her from her village. Her braid had been cut short, her dialect forbidden. She was told her voice might ruin her chances. She was told that silence was beautiful. Beyond the corridor lay the gate to the inner court. Not a place, but a fate. Once selected, the girl would never return home. Her body would belong to the emperor. Her womb would belong to history. Her memories to no one. The moment came like a knife through silk. A hand, pale, ringed, pointed at Milan. No words. Just the nod. The rest of the girls were ushered away like broken furniture. Milan stepped forward. Behind her, the corridor fell silent again, ready for the next name to vanish. She crossed the threshold, barefoot on cold stone, into a world built on ritual and surveillance. A world where beauty meant compliance, where obedience was the highest art, where girlhood was the price of ambition, but never hers. Somewhere behind a carved screen, a man she would never meet decided she was worthy, not of love, not of a name, but of being trained, not to become someone, but to be reshaped into something. They took her name first. The court lady held a brush soaked in red ink, and with a single stroke on parchment, Milan became third-rank plum attendant. Not a title of affection, but of hierarchy, a rung on an invisible ladder no one ever climbed. Her past dissolved into protocol. The plum blossom from her father's orchard had withered the moment her feet crossed the threshold. Then came the raising of the body in a cold chamber lit by oil lamps. Girls sat on low stools as their hair was shaved at the nape, the long, black braids of girlhood removed in quiet ceremony. Each strand fell like a sentence being cut short. One girl wept silently as the blade grazed her scalp. Another sat still, her gaze fixed on a crack in the tile, as if trying to crawl inside it. They were no longer daughters, no longer villagers. They were offerings now, anonymous petals floating in a sealed garden. Clothes came next. Their childhood. Robes were confiscated and burned. In their place, silks of imperial hue, tight at the sleeves, heavy with embroidered dragons and phoenixes, symbols of power that did not belong to them. The fabric chafed at the skin. The embroidery was never for comfort, only spectacle. Their dialects were corrected with slaps. Their laughter, if it rose too loud, was met with a glance colder than any winter wind. Meals were taken in silence, eyes kept lowered. Thoughts, if they stirred, were best left unspoken. One night, Mielin whispered her real name to herself beneath a blanket. It felt foreign, forbidden, like a sin wrapped in syllables. No one had spoken it in weeks. She tried to remember her mother's voice and found she could no longer picture the mouth that had spoken it. Each morning she was greeted not by a name, but a schedule. Bow here, step there, breathe, but quietly. This was not a transformation. It was a burial, slow, ceremonial, and unseen. The girl was gone, and what remained was a shadow, trained to mimic light. She was ready every night, though he never came. The lanterns in the hall of tranquil harmony flickered against polished bronze mirrors, casting dim halos over rows of seated women, painted, perfumed, and posed like statues of hope. Each one had spent hours in silent preparation, powdered skin brushed pale as moonlight, hair coiled into imperial knots, robes layered with embroidery no one would see. They waited, always waiting for a glance, a gesture, a nod from the eunuch who carried the emperor's tablet like a sacred relic. It was said that one turn of his wrist could alter a woman's fate, from ghost to goddess, from silence to a whispered name on the emperor's lips. But most were never summoned. Mielin sat at the edge of the gathering, her spine aching from stillness. She had not been chosen in 3 years, yet every evening she painted her lips with crushed petals and dipped her hands in milk water, because hope, once stitched into the bones, is difficult to unthread. Around her, the younger ones were blooming, 17, 18, glowing with the desperate hunger of the newly trained. They smiled with polished eyes, laughed at shadows, flinched when older concubines brushed past them like wind over worn stone. The forgotten ones moved differently. Their steps were soundless, their eyes quiet. They had learned to age discreetly, in corridors, behind screens, within themselves. They did not cry. Tears drew attention, and attention could be fatal. Instead, they wilted in beauty's shadow. Year by invisible year, favor, once granted, was never permanent. A single night could lift a concubine's rank, but only the emperor decided if that candle would be relit. Sometimes Mielin imagined his face, not from memory, but invention. A silhouette behind silk curtains. A voice filtered through layers of ritual. He was not a man to her. He was a season, brief, unpredictable, and always gone too soon. In this world, it was not cruelty that broke them. It was neglect. Cold, elegant, systematic, because there is a violence in being unseen, a quiet erosion sharper than any blade. And in the palace, forgetting a woman was as easy as never looking at her again. She smiled at the woman she hated most in the world, and poured her tea without spilling a drop. In the harem, war was not fought with swords. It was waged in glances, in silence, in the slow turning of fans, and the careful placement of a hairpin. There were no allies, only shifting arrangements of necessity. Every woman was both pawn and queen, depending on who watched. Mielin learned this the hard way. After years of waiting, she had grown invisible. But invisibility, she discovered, had uses. She heard things others missed. She noticed the subtle tremble in a rival's wrist, the glance exchanged between a favored concubine and a palace eunuch. She began to memorize the court's unspoken rules, and then, slowly, to bend them, she complimented the girl who mocked her, praised the embroidery of a robe stitched by a woman whose servant once slipped laudanum into her rice. She learned how to praise without sounding desperate, how to defer without seeming weak. Her movements became strategy, her words currency. The emperor, distant as a star, remained largely untouched by this theater. But his favor could be lured, directed, sometimes through the whisper of a loyal maid in the right corridor, sometimes by slipping a line of poetry into a song he once admired. The birth of a son was the highest victory. One concubine, barely 18, secured her place with swollen ankles and morning sickness. But even that was not safe. Stillbirths, poisonings, accusations of witchcraft. No one wept in public. Grief was seen as ambition poorly managed. Rumors could kill, so could beauty. So could a smile too well timed. And yet, within this cruel ballet, there were flashes of brilliance. Women who played their roles so well, they bent the rules around them. They became legends in hushed tones. Stories passed through generations of servants. The one who outlasted 4 emperors. The one who wrote secret letters through silk embroidery. The one who made her enemy disappear without leaving a bruise, Mealing, did not become legend. But she survived. And survival was no small triumph, because in the harem, even silence could be a weapon, and a powdered face could hide a kingdom of knives. The night began long before sunset. A eunuch entered with a scroll, its surface gleaming with fresh ink and imperial indifference. The emperor had turned the jade tablet. A name was chosen. No words were spoken, only a nod, only the slow drawing. Back of a curtain, Mealing felt her blood retreat beneath her skin. She was led to the preparation chamber. 4 attendants moved around her like ghostly clock hands, each trained in the ritual choreography of readiness. Her body was washed in water, perfumed with magnolia and ground pearl. Every inch scrubbed, softened, shaped, not with tenderness, but with precision. Her nails painted, her lips rouged, her breath rinsed with honeyed herbs. No one looked her in the eye. They dressed her in translucent layers, fine enough to ripple at a breath. The fabric smelled of incense and old silk, sacred, suffocating. Around her ankles, they tied bells no larger than a moth's wing. They must not sound. Sound meant shame. Before she left the chamber, a tutor whispered a final reminder. Do not speak unless addressed. Do not shiver. Do not close your eyes too soon. She walked toward the dragon bed like a sacrifice offered to. Silence. What followed was not cruelty, but choreography. The emperor arrived, draped in gold and shadow. His presence filled the room like smoke. He did not ask her name. He would not remember it. There was no room for desire, only performance. Her breath was measured, her tears swallowed. The act was not an act of intimacy. It was submission sealed in ceremony. A woman's body, woven into protocol. When it ended, she was wrapped in a fresh robe and led away before the candles had finished burning. Not kissed, not thanked, not touched again, just turned away, like a page. They said she smiled at the wrong moment, a soft, upward curl of the mouth, too confident, too visible. The emperor had been passing by. He hadn't noticed, but another concubine had. And in the harem, silence never meant safety. It meant someone was listening, waiting to speak. By morning, the girl was gone. Her chamber swept clean. Her name struck from the record. Her robes burned. They whispered that she had been sent to a nunnery. Others swore she was forced to drink gold powder, her insides gilded before burial. But no one knew. That was the point. In the palace, punishment was rarely loud. It arrived like dew, soft, inevitable, soaking everything in dread. Disobedience was not defined. It shifted, changed, hovered like mist. One day, a poem might win favor. The next, it might be seen as mockery. There were no laws, only moods, only glances. Mealing remembered a girl who sang too beautifully. She was told to stop. When she hesitated, she was locked in the fragrance. Chamber for 3 days, surrounded by incense, until her skin blistered and her voice never returned. Another was rumored to be pregnant without permission. Her body was never found. Obedience, then, was not a virtue. It was armor, fragile, cracking, essential. Mealing kept her eyes low, her tone neutral, her thoughts buried in the hollow between ribs. Each night, she wondered if her silence was enough, if her stillness looked too rehearsed, if survival meant shrinking herself until nothing was left. And yet, even as she bowed perfectly and walked with measured grace, a thought haunted her, that in this world, perfection could be fatal. Because the palace did not punish mistakes, it punished unpredictability, and the most dangerous thing a woman could do was exist outside the script. No monuments bear their names. The halls they once walked remain, restored and polished for tourists, their echoes painted over in gold. But the women, thousands of them, vanished without inscription. Their stories were not burned. They were never written. Milan's chamber was eventually reassigned. Her belongings, few and impersonal, were swept away with a lacquered broom. The perfume she once wore clung faintly to the folds of a discarded sash, then faded. Servants remembered her smile, or maybe someone else's. Memory, too, obeyed the throne. The palace was a perfect machine of forgetting. Some concubines were buried with modest stones. Most were not buried at all, laid in unmarked graves far from the palace walls, denied the rites they once whispered in their sleep. Their hair still combed in ritual curls, their mouths closed forever in trained silence, and still they are called fortunate because they were beautiful, because they were near power, because they died quietly. But what is fortune when your soul was never truly yours? When every gesture, every breath was choreographed for a gaze that could vanish at will? History preserved the names of emperors, of generals, of poets who never tasted the bitter mouthful of submission. But it forgot the women who swallowed their identities for empire, who sang and danced and bled and withered for a man who might never meet their eyes. And perhaps that was always the plan, to make them ghosts while they still breathed, to ensure their pain was elegant, their suffering seamless, to train 1,000 women not just to please, but to disappear gracefully in the end. The silk walls remembered nothing, but somewhere beneath them, bones remain, quiet, nameless, waiting for someone to speak their story back into the world.